This week, we are going to focus on regression testing. Regression testing is a special type of testing performed after a code change has been made to the product. The goal is to verify that the code change does not impact the existing functionality of the system. In other words, the goal is to make sure that nothing was broken. Regression testing is focused on more than just the code that you changed, but the entire product. So let's take a look a little bit about the differences between retesting and regression testing, because sometimes that gets confusing for students. Retesting means testing the functionality or bug again to ensure that the code is fixed. If it is not fixed, defects need to be reopened. If it is fixed, then defects is closed. Regression testing means testing your software application when it undergoes a code change to ensure that the new code has not affected other parts of the software.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
I gave an example a few weeks ago of a digital simulation that was poorly written. If you recall, I mentioned that there were no tests written, and if you made a code change, you were unsure if that would break something else within the product, which oftentimes it did. This is where regression testing comes into play. Let me give you another example of regression testing. So suppose we are in a banking application, and suppose that we are in the current balance modular. So instead of showing the most current balance as the app currently shows, the client also wants to see customized reports based on the date and also the amount of transactions. Obviously, any such change needs to be tested. Once deployed, testing enhancement, system changes, or correction forms part of the maintenance testing. Suppose in our banking application, your current balance is $2,000. Using the new enhancement, you check out your balance from a year ago and you notice that it was $500. So that's the old balance from a year ago. You then enter the transaction modular because you want to make a transaction and you want to transfer some money elsewhere. So in this case, you actually want to transfer $1,000. In order to proceed, the transfer modular checks for the current balance, but instead of sending over the current balance, it actually sends the old balance of $500. This results in the transaction being failed. As you can observe, code changes wherein current balance modular only, but still transfer modular is affected. Regression testing is carried out to check modifications in software has not caused unintended adverse side effects, as in this example. There are 2 reading assignments for this week, and you are to select a project for this week's lab. So that's what we're focused on for the reading portion. So as you can see here, the 2 readings are the realities of software testing and structure-based techniques. The lab this week will be to make a code change in a code base of your choice. We are then to determine what parts of the project will be impacted by the code change. The final step will be to verify that no other parts of the project were negatively impacted. In order to do this, it is necessary to find a code base that you can work with. The technology does not matter here, such as the language, the platform, etc. The only thing that is important is the complexity needs to be non-trivial. 1,000 lines of code is a good start, but the larger the project, the better. If you are having any difficulties with this, then let me know. I also encourage you to share your thoughts and suggestions with the rest of the class. Not only will you be able to use your peers as help, but others may have similar problems. One of the hardest parts for your team may be what you need to change. Having an application that you are familiar with would help in this regard. Also, being familiar with the code base will also help you. For this assignment, you are going to create a regression test plan. This is to be done in 2 steps. First, identify a code change that can be made in the code base. Second, create a set of test cases which will verify the change. So with your partners, you're going to identify a code change that can be made in the code base previously selected. This change should not alter the functionality of their project, but rather modify an implementation detail. In other words, the functionality of the code should not change. And here they gave some examples in the instructions. I'd go ahead and read through those. I'm going to focus on this one right now. I did create a template for this, which I hope will be beneficial for you. So based off of this first one here, I identified the code change. So in this specific example, I have a title, description, and acceptance criteria. So the title is pretty simple. It's just the title of the change that you will be making. In this case, we're going to create a Sudoku board class. The description is just the description of your code change. So in this case, as a Sudoku game, I want the board creation to be created from a board class so that my code is using classes instead of a built-in data types. As I noted here in my comment, this may seem kind of odd the way I structured this sentence. And I did it intentionally just to teach you something more. So this is written in such a way that you might find in the Agile world. So when identifying work in Agile, we usually create user stories or technical stories. User stories are stories written in such a way that the user who will be using it could understand the description. So it's really written in plain text. It's not very technical. Technical stories are stories that the user would not see. So in this case, it'd be you're making a data structure change. The functionality is not going to change for the application, which in this case is the case, but it's more technical. So I shared some links here for more information around user stories and technical stories. The next part is the acceptance criteria, and this is where you are going to get into the details of the code change. So in other words, think of this as the definition of done. And I explain here that acceptance criteria here is part of the Agile world as well. And I explain here that the acceptance criteria is part of the user stories and technical stories that you'll find in Agile. As it mentions here, acceptance criteria refers to the set of predefined requirements that must be met to mark a user story complete. Acceptance criteria are also sometimes called the definition of done because they determine the scope and the requirements that must be executed by developers to consider the user story finished. So this is really where you can get into the details of the code and the change that's going to happen. I did share a link more about acceptance criteria for you to review if you'd like. So the second part of this is to create a regression test plan. This is what the template is actually going to be doing. But the second part here is going to focus on creating new test cases. So these test cases must be based off the code changes that you have identified. So if you're doing this right, you might be able to take a look at your acceptance criteria and identify test cases that you can come up with. That's the reason I wrote it in this way. I hope that learning a little bit more about acceptance criteria and how to write them could help you benefit in coming up with your test cases. So the last part of this is you're actually going to implement your plan. So the big thing here is that you need to, one, do a pre-test. So conduct all the test cases and report the results. So hopefully each test will pass. So that gives you a starting point to make sure that when you go and make your code change, that nothing breaks. So you will write your test, you run your test against the current code base, and hopefully all passes. So if there's an issue, make sure it's not an issue with your test cases in your test. If there happens to be a bug with the functionality of the program, you'll just have to keep that in mind. So the next part then would be you actually make your code change. The last part then, after you have completed your code changes, you will then run your test again. And hopefully everything passes. If you see an issue that pops up, then chances are something broke within your code change. So if your tests fail, that means you know that you broke something and you need to go back and look at your code again. So this process is what you're going to be doing for this last assignment. And then you're going to report on your code changes.
Is this the bathroom?
No! Go home!